Officer Daniel had been working night shifts for years, and he thought he had seen everything. The quiet streets, the occasional reckless driver, and the late-night store robberies. None of it surprised him anymore. But lately, something strange had been happening. He couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching him. At first, he thought it was just his imagination. Maybe he was just tired. Long hours on the job could do that to anyone. But then, he started noticing small things. Tiny movements in the shadows, a flicker of motion just outside the glow of a street lamp. It was as if someone was following him, but every time he turned around, there was no one there. One night, as he drove his patrol car down a quiet neighborhood street, he saw it again, a small figure moving quickly behind a row of parked cars. He hit the brakes and squinted into the darkness. The figure froze. Daniel's heartbeat quickened. He had dealt with all kinds of criminals, but something about this felt different. Whoever it was, they were small, too small to be an adult. Slowly, Daniel stepped out of his car, his flashlight in hand. The air was cold, and the street was empty except for the distant hum of passing traffic. He walked forward, his boots crunching softly on the pavement. "Hey," he called out, his voice calm but firm. "I know you're there. Come on out." For a few seconds, there was only silence. Then, a slight rustling sound. Daniel raised his flashlight, sweeping it over the parked cars. And that's when he saw him. A little boy, no older than 7 or 8, crouched low behind a car. His clothes were worn, his face half hidden in the shadows, and his eyes were filled with fear. The sight of the child made Daniel pause. He had expected a teenager playing a prank, maybe even a thief, but not this. Not a little boy, alone in the middle of the night. Daniel lowered his flashlight slightly, trying not to startle the child. "Hey there, kid," he said, softening his voice. "What are you doing out here so late?" The boy didn't answer. He just stared at Daniel, his small hands gripping the edge of the car. His breath was quick, like he had been running or maybe even crying. Daniel took a careful step closer. "Are you lost? Where are your parents?" Still, no answer. The boy shifted slightly, as if deciding whether to run. Daniel held up a hand. "It's okay. You're not in trouble. I just want to help." The boy hesitated, then slowly shook his head. Daniel felt a strange chill run down his spine. Something wasn't right. The boy wasn't lost. He had been following him. But why? And then, for the first time, the boy spoke, his voice so quiet that Daniel almost didn't hear it. "I was waiting for you." A cold feeling settled in Daniel's stomach. He didn't know why, but something about those words sent a shiver down his spine. Daniel felt his breath catch for a moment. The little boy's words echoed in his mind. "I was waiting for you." It didn't make sense. Why would a child be waiting for him in the middle of the night? Something wasn't right. The boy stood frozen, his small hands gripping the edge of the car, his wide eyes staring at Daniel. He looked scared, but there was something else in his eyes too, something that made Daniel's chest tighten. Was it hope? Or maybe desperation? Daniel took a careful step closer, lowering himself slightly so he wouldn't look so intimidating. "Hey, buddy, what's your name?" he asked gently. The boy didn't answer. Instead, he glanced around nervously, as if afraid someone else might be watching. The way he kept looking over his shoulder made Daniel uneasy. It was as if the child was expecting someone, or something, to appear from the darkness. Daniel softened his voice even more. "It's okay. You're safe. I promise." The boy hesitated, his small fingers clenching into fists. Then, just as Daniel thought he wouldn't say anything, he whispered, I can't tell you." Daniel frowned. That wasn't the answer he was expecting. "Why not?" he asked. The boy looked down at his worn-out shoes, shuffling his feet. "Because, if I do, they'll find me." A sharp chill ran down Daniel's spine. They? Who was he talking about? Someone was after him. Daniel's protective instincts kicked in. He glanced around, scanning the dark street for any sign of danger. The neighborhood was quiet, almost too quiet. The streetlights flickered softly, casting long shadows on the pavement. Daniel turned back to the boy. "Listen, kid, if someone is trying to hurt you, I can help. I'm a police officer. That's my job." He pointed to the badge on his uniform. "You don't have to be afraid anymore." The boy looked up at him, his lips trembling slightly. For a second, it seemed like he wanted to believe Daniel. But then he took a step back, shaking his head. "No," he whispered. They said I can't trust anyone." Daniel felt a lump form in his throat. Who had told this child that? And what had he been through to make him so afraid? Taking a deep breath, Daniel reached out his hand. "I don't know who told you that, but I promise you, whatever is going on, you don't have to deal with it alone. You're not alone anymore." The boy's eyes flickered with something: doubt, hesitation, maybe even longing. His small fingers twitched as if he was considering taking Daniel's hand. But before he could decide, the distant sound of a car engine rumbled through the night. The boy's head snapped up, his body going rigid. His eyes widened in pure terror. "They're coming," he gasped. And before Daniel could react, the boy turned and ran into the darkness. Daniel's heart pounded as he watched the boy disappear into the darkness. The fear in the child's eyes had been real, too real. He couldn't just let him run off like that. Something was terribly wrong, and Daniel knew he had to find out what. Without wasting a second, he sprinted after the boy. His boots hit the pavement hard as he followed the sound of small, hurried footsteps. The child was fast, darting through the narrow alleys between houses, slipping through gaps that Daniel couldn't fit through. But Daniel had years of experience chasing people down, and he wasn't about to lose this one, especially not a scared little boy who clearly needed help. "Kid, stop," he called out, his voice firm but not angry. "I'm not going to hurt you." The boy didn't stop. He turned a sharp corner and vanished behind a row of dumpsters. When Daniel reached the spot, he slowed down and listened carefully. His sharp instincts told him the boy was hiding nearby, holding his breath, waiting for Daniel to give up and leave. Daniel took a deep breath. He didn't want to scare the kid any more than he already was. "Listen, I don't know who you're running from," he said, his voice calm. "But I do know this: you can't run forever. If you're in trouble, you need someone to help you. And right now, I'm the only one here." Silence. For a moment, Daniel thought the boy wouldn't answer. But then he heard the faintest sound: a sniffle. It came from behind a stack of old wooden crates. Carefully, Daniel stepped closer, shining his flashlight in the direction of the sound. And there he was. The boy was curled up in a tight ball, his arms wrapped around his knees. His face was streaked with dirt, his clothes torn at the edges. But what caught Daniel's attention the most was how thin he looked, as if he hadn't eaten properly in days. Daniel crouched down, keeping some distance so he wouldn't scare him off again. "You don't have to be afraid," he said softly. "I just want to talk." The boy peeked up at him through messy strands of hair. His lips trembled, as if he wanted to say something but couldn't bring himself to. Daniel sighed and sat down on the pavement, letting out a tired chuckle. "You know, I've been a cop for a long time. I've chased a lot of people, but I've never had to chase a little kid like this before." The boy blinked, surprised. For the first time, the tiniest hint of curiosity appeared in his eyes. Encouraged, Daniel continued, "I bet you're hungry. Am I right?" The boy hesitated, then gave the smallest nod. Daniel smiled. "Tell you what, I've got a sandwich in my car. I was going to eat it later, but I think you need it more than I do. What do you say?" The boy didn't answer right away, but Daniel saw something shift in his expression, a tiny spark of trust. And that was enough to give Daniel hope. Daniel sat still, waiting for the boy to decide. He knew he couldn't rush him. Trust took time, especially for a child who had been running and hiding. The boy stared at him, his small fingers twitching slightly, as if unsure whether to believe him or not. Finally, after what felt like forever, the boy moved. Slowly, cautiously, he uncurled himself from his hiding spot. His legs were shaky as he stood up, but his eyes never left Daniel's face. Daniel kept his voice calm. "Good choice, kid. Come on, let's go to my car. It's warm inside, and I promise you'll feel better after eating something." The boy hesitated again, looking around nervously as if expecting someone to jump out from the shadows. His little hands gripped the edges of his worn-out shirt, a nervous habit Daniel had seen in scared children before. "Don't worry," Daniel assured him. "No one's going to hurt you while I'm here." That seemed to convince him, at least a little. The boy took a small step forward, then another. Daniel stood up and walked slowly toward his patrol car, making sure not to move too fast. He didn't want the kid to panic and run again. When they reached the car, Daniel opened the passenger door and pulled out his sandwich from a brown paper bag. It wasn't anything special, just a simple ham and cheese sandwich he had packed for his shift. But when he handed it to the boy, the child took it with both hands like it was the best thing he had ever seen. He didn't wait. He took a bite, then another, chewing quickly. Daniel watched him, a lump forming in his throat. This wasn't just hunger. This was starvation. The kid had probably gone days without a proper meal. After a few minutes, when the boy had eaten almost the entire sandwich, Daniel spoke again. "So, are you ready to tell me your name?" The boy paused mid-bite. His small fingers tightened around the sandwich, and for a second, Daniel thought he wouldn't answer. But then, in a soft voice, the boy mumbled, "Liam." Daniel smiled. "Liam, that's a good name." Liam looked up at him, a flicker of uncertainty in his eyes. "You're not mad at me?" he asked hesitantly. Daniel frowned. "Why would I be mad?" Liam lowered his gaze, staring at the half-eaten sandwich in his hands. "Because I followed you." Daniel let out a small chuckle. "Kid, I've dealt with much bigger problems than being followed by a 7-year-old. But I do need to know, why were you following me?" Liam swallowed hard. His lips pressed together, as if he was trying to hold back something painful. Then, in a barely audible whisper, he said, "Because my dad told me to find you." Daniel's breath caught in his throat. His mind raced. "Your dad," he repeated carefully. Liam nodded. Before he was gone, he said if anything bad ever happened, I should find you. He said you would help me." Daniel felt the blood drain from his face. His hands went cold. He had no idea who Liam's father was, but the fact that the man had told his son to find him, specifically him, meant something was terribly wrong. Daniel felt his stomach tighten. The way Liam said those words, so quiet, so broken, sent a chill through him. He had no memory of meeting this boy's father, yet the man had told Liam to find him. Why? Who was he? And what had happened to him? Daniel took a deep breath, keeping his voice steady. "Liam, can you tell me about your dad? What was his name?" Liam hesitated, his small hands gripping the edge of his shirt again. He looked down at his feet, shifting uncomfortably. "His name was Michael," he whispered. Daniel frowned. The name didn't ring a bell, but something about this felt familiar. He had handled so many cases over the years, people in trouble, families in danger. Could Michael have been one of them? He tried again. "What happened to him, Liam?" Liam squeezed his eyes shut, as if trying to block out a painful memory. For a moment, Daniel thought he wouldn't answer. But then, in a trembling voice, the boy said, "Bad people came." Daniel's heartbeat quickened. "Bad people." Liam nodded slowly. "They were looking for something. I don't know what. My dad told me to hide, so I crawled under the bed. He told me to stay quiet no matter what." Daniel's hands curled into fists. He could picture it so clearly. The terror, the confusion, a small boy hiding while his father faced something dangerous alone. Liam took a shaky breath. I heard yelling. Then there was a loud noise. And after that, everything was quiet. Daniel swallowed hard. He had been in law enforcement long enough to know what that meant. The boy's father was gone, and now Liam was completely alone. Daniel forced himself to stay calm. Liam, when did this happen? Liam's voice was barely a whisper. A few days ago. Daniel's chest tightened. A few days. That meant Liam had been out on the streets all this time, scared and hiding, with no food, no help, nothing. And worse, if these people had been after his father, there was a good chance they were still looking for Liam too. Daniel took a deep breath, trying to push down the anger building inside him. This little boy had lost everything, and yet the system had completely failed him. But not anymore. Daniel looked Liam in the eye. Listen to me, kid. You did the right thing coming to me. You're not alone anymore, okay? I'm going to make sure you're safe. Liam blinked up at him, a flicker of something new in his eyes. Hope. But before Daniel could say anything else, his radio crackled to life. A dispatcher's voice came through. All units, be advised. Suspicious individuals spotted near Oak Street. Possible connection to recent violent incidents. Proceed with caution. Daniel's blood ran cold. Oak Street was just a few blocks away. He turned to Liam. Liam, did your dad tell you why they were after him? Liam hesitated, then nodded. He said they were afraid he knew something. Something important. Daniel's jaw clenched. Whatever this was, it wasn't over. And now, those dangerous people might be closer than he thought. Daniel's mind raced. This wasn't just about a missing child. This was something bigger. Dangerous people had been after Liam's father, and now they might be looking for Liam too. He needed to act fast. He looked down at Liam, who was staring at him with wide, fearful eyes. The boy had already been through too much. Daniel had to keep him safe. All right, kid, he said firmly. We're getting out of here. Liam hesitated. Where? Daniel glanced around the dark, quiet street. If those people were close, standing out in the open wasn't safe. He needed to get Liam somewhere secure, somewhere no one could find him. He unlocked the car door. Get in. Liam climbed into the passenger seat without a word. His small hands trembled slightly as he pulled the seatbelt across his chest. Daniel got behind the wheel and started the engine. He kept his eyes on the road, but his thoughts were running in 100 different directions. Who were these people? What did Liam's father know that made them so dangerous? And the biggest question of all, how had Michael known to tell his son to find him? Daniel reached for his radio. Dispatch, this is Officer Daniel. I need backup at my location. Possible connection to Oak Street suspects. The radio crackled, but before dispatch could respond, Daniel saw it. A dark SUV parked at the end of the street. Its headlights were off, but the way it was positioned, half hidden in the shadows, sent a warning through Daniel's gut. Someone was watching. Daniel's grip tightened on the wheel. He couldn't be sure if they had seen Liam yet, but he wasn't taking any chances. He shifted the car into drive. Hang on, kid. He pulled away from the curb, driving smoothly at first, nothing to make them suspicious. But as soon as he turned the corner, he pressed down on the gas. Liam tensed in his seat. Are they coming? Daniel checked the rearview mirror. For a second, nothing happened. Then, headlights flared to life. The SUV pulled onto the street, moving fast. Daniel cursed under his breath. Yeah, they're coming. Liam shrank into his seat, gripping the armrest. What do they want? Daniel's jaw tightened. That's what we're going to find out. But first, we lose them. He turned sharply onto a side street, weaving through the neighborhood. He knew these roads well. Years of patrolling had taught him every shortcut, every alley, every dead end. But the SUV wasn't giving up. It followed, its engine roaring as it sped up. Daniel made another turn, then another, trying to shake them. But the vehicle stayed on his tail. Liam's breathing was quick. They won't stop. Daniel glanced at him, then back at the road. He had one last option. He grabbed the radio again. Dispatch, I have a tail. Black SUV. Possible suspects from Oak Street case. I need assistance now. A pause. Then, copy that, Officer Daniel. Back up on the way. Daniel exhaled. He just had to hold on a little longer. But before he could make his next turn, the SUV suddenly sped up, closing the gap fast. Then, the unthinkable happened. The SUV swerved, slamming into the back of Daniel's car. The impact was sudden and brutal. The police car lurched forward, tires screeching against the pavement as Daniel fought to keep control. Liam let out a frightened gasp, gripping the seatbelt tightly. "Hold on, kid," Daniel shouted, his hand steady on the wheel. The SUV rammed them again, harder this time. The back of the police car fishtailed, skidding dangerously close to the sidewalk. Daniel's heart pounded. He had been in high-speed chases before, but this was different. They weren't just trying to escape. They were being hunted. Daniel took a sharp turn onto a narrow alley, barely squeezing through. The SUV hesitated for a moment before following. "They're not giving up," Liam whispered, his voice shaking. Daniel's mind worked fast. He couldn't outrun them in the city streets. Too many turns, too much traffic. He needed a plan. Then he saw it. Up ahead, an old construction site with a half-built building and stacks of concrete blocks. It wasn't perfect, but it was cover. Daniel made a split-second decision. He cut the wheel hard, swerving into the site, kicking up dust as the police car slid to a stop behind a pile of steel beams. "Out. Now," Daniel ordered. Liam scrambled to unbuckle his seatbelt, and Daniel reached over, helping him. The second the boy was free, Daniel pulled him out of the car and led him behind the stacks of concrete. They crouched low, hearts pounding. The SUV screeched to a stop at the entrance of the site. The engine idled, and Daniel could see the shadowy figures inside. Then, the doors opened. At least 3 men stepped out. Their movements were slow, confident. They weren't afraid. Daniel pulled Liam closer, his voice low. "Listen to me, Liam. No matter what happens, stay behind me." "Got it." Liam nodded quickly, his small hands gripping Daniel's sleeve. The men started moving, scanning the area. One of them had a flashlight, the beam sweeping across the piles of construction materials. Daniel's mind raced. Backup was coming, but they weren't here yet. He had to buy time. The men split up, moving carefully. One of them, a tall man in a dark jacket, stopped just a few feet away. Daniel reached for his gun, but before he could act, Liam whispered something that sent chills down his spine. "That's him." Daniel stiffened. "Who?" Liam's voice was barely a breath. "The man who took my dad." Daniel's grip on his weapon tightened. His pulse thundered in his ears. This wasn't just about scaring them off. This was about justice. Daniel's heart pounded as he stared at the man Liam had pointed out. So this was him, the person responsible for taking Liam's father away. The one who had likely left the boy all alone in the world. Daniel tightened his grip on his gun, but he knew he had to be smart. 3 against 1 wasn't good odds, and Liam's safety came first. He glanced at the boy, who was watching the men with wide, terrified eyes. Daniel took a deep breath, forcing himself to stay calm. He leaned closer to Liam and whispered, "Stay low. Don't move until I say, okay." Liam nodded quickly, his little hands shaking. The men were getting closer, their boots crunching against the gravel. The one in the dark jacket spoke first. "Come on out, officer. We don't want to make this messy." His voice was smooth, too calm for someone chasing down a cop and a kid. Daniel's mind raced. He needed to stall. Funny. He called out, keeping his voice steady, "Because ramming my car and chasing me down sure looks messy to me." The man chuckled. "Just a misunderstanding. Hand over the boy." And we walk away. No trouble. Daniel's blood boiled. "Not happening." The man sighed, shaking his head. "I was hoping you'd say that." He raised a hand, and suddenly, the two men with him started moving faster, spreading out. They were trying to corner him. Daniel knew he had seconds to act. He reached for his radio. "Dispatch, I need backup now," he whispered urgently. Then he turned to Liam. "When I say run, you run as fast as you can. Straight for that fence. Don't look back." Liam's eyes filled with fear, but he nodded. Daniel braced himself. Then he moved. He stepped out from behind a concrete block, gun raised. "Freeze!" he shouted. The men hesitated for half a second, just long enough. "Run, Liam," Daniel yelled. Liam took off, sprinting toward the fence. One of the men turned, reaching for him, but Daniel fired a warning shot into the air. The loud bang echoed through the construction site. The men ducked, startled, and Liam kept running. Then, sirens, flashing blue and red lights, filled the night as police cars roared onto the scene. The men panicked. The one in the dark jacket glared at Daniel before turning and running toward the SUV. The others followed, scrambling to escape. Daniel chased after them, but more officers poured in, blocking their path. Within seconds, the men were surrounded. Daniel turned back just in time to see Liam reach the fence. A uniformed officer caught him, gently pulling him to safety. Relief flooded through Daniel as he ran toward them. Liam looked up at him, eyes wide. "You did good, kid," Daniel said, ruffling Liam's hair. Liam exhaled shakily. "Are they gone?" Daniel glanced back. The men were being handcuffed, their faces hard with anger. "They're not going to hurt you ever again," Daniel promised. Liam's shoulders sagged with relief. For the first time since Daniel had met him, he saw something different in the boy's eyes. Hope. And Daniel knew this wasn't just another case. Liam wasn't just another kid in trouble. This was the beginning of something new, a second chance, a new family. And Daniel wasn't going to let him go.